Välkommen! I'm John Denor, and this is Goblin Points, a podcast covering MCDM, the MCDM community, and whatever else MCDM related. It feels longer ago, but it's barely a month since the crowdfunding campaign for the RPG closed. It ended up being MCDM's biggest crowdfunder to date. Matt mentioned that it'll probably be their biggest ever, and I'm not inclined to disagree. There's something of a lightning in a bottle feel about it. Nevertheless, we don't know what the future holds. You know, something dessert. Here's what's new with the RPG for January 2024. Pre-orders are now live for the RPG books. If you didn't get in on the campaign, you'll now be able to pick up the books in PDF or physical form, in addition to limited edition hardcovers. There's a link directly to the shop in the link section. We know that patrons will get the 2 core rulebooks, Heroes and Monsters, as PDFs, if they've been a patron for at least 5 months in advance of their release. Patrons will receive the books as soon as they're done, which means they will not release at the same time, so the 5 months before release will be different for each book. It looks like Heroes will be released first, but it wouldn't be much use without enemies to fight. The plan is to release packets of monsters, not unlike how it was done with Flea Mortals, while they're being developed. By the time Heroes drop, patrons will already have access to multiple packets of monsters to use with the rules. January has been a month with a lot of talk about the RPG. With the playtest packet dropped for patrons, a lot of new people have been able to play the game. While December was dominated by news about the RPG, this month has been dominated by people reading and playing the RPG. Patrons have been encouraged to fill out a feedback form after playing, which Matt and James are working their way through. While they likely won't share detailed data from the survey, expect to see them refer to data from it on multiple occasions. In general, the response is very positive, with Matt saying that on a scale from 1 to 5, most responses are in the 4 or 5 range. James pointed out, however, that responses that deviate from the consensus are also important, saying that such responses might lead to changes in the design just as much as a consensus. Both Matt and James have stated multiple times that it's important to understand that the survey responses are not driving design directly. The responses are used to detect which rules and system needs tweaking, not which rules or systems should be included. The playtest packet is still available to download and won't go away, but there will be more packets in the future. James mentioned that there might be a packet each quarter, but that's more of a desire and definitely not a promise. All in all, James calls the test a success. One of his fears was that there would be a sudden drop in patron subscribers once people got the playtest packet, but that's not been the case. Playtest packets for the backers are scheduled for the summer. There have been a bit of back and forth, but it looks like June or July is the current goal. The packet that's released for backers is expected to be more polished than the patron packet. Matt has stated that people on the Patreon are there for the details and early information, while backers are expecting more developed and polished stuff. Speaking of polish, there have been some design tweaks to the rules this month. While the rules may change, James said in a stream that the dice will not move away from regular polyhedrals. That's what they sold to people in the crowdfunder, and it would feel like they tricked people if they moved away from that now. Chance hits or opportunity attacks were added to prevent too much movement on the battlefield. Something like this were already possible for some classes, but it's now a general feature. Testers were saying that they didn't have sufficient tools to protect squishy heroes from being ganged up on. They are testing different ways of doing damage. Regular testers, and now Patreon testers too, have mentioned that it feels samey to only roll 2d6 when attacking. At the moment, they're testing a system where psionic powers says which dice to roll, and your kit determines which dice to roll for weapon attacks, instead of giving you an attack bonus. Improvised weapons and bare knuckles do 1d4 plus a characteristic bonus. This system also makes it easier to scale down damage, and may lead to introduction of even more kinds of dice. The problem now is that critical hits are different for every type of roll. With 2d6, 11 or 12 was a critical hit, but with different dice, that doesn't work anymore, and a new way of determining critical hits will be needed. At the end of January, there was also a Designing the Game video on the evolution and the different attempts at damage rolls and defenses in the game. Ranged attacks are currently superior to melee, but that's being worked on. James also mentioned that he thinks there will be an advantage to moving close to a ranged enemy. The system for overkilling minions might go away from melee attacks. If you want to kill multiple minions with a single attack, you'll have to use an ability that targets multiple creatures or an area of effect ability. Higher level characters will probably be able to make multiple attacks on a turn, making it possible to kill multiple minions. James has written a whole Patreon post on the overkilling minion rules and what they are currently trying out. While higher level heroes have not been designed yet, James mentioned an idea for a higher level ability. Heroes converting their heroic resource into an extra maneuver on their turn. James also mentioned that it's not a goal to make sure monsters doesn't have a null result turn, e.g. a turn where they effectively don't do anything. The director will have multiple turns in a round to do something, so the feeling of getting a dud turn is not as present for them. There have been some talk about character customization in the past month. I suspect this is because those who've tested the game want to make their own characters, not just use the pregens in the playtest packet. While they are working on getting the core rules done, character customization is not being worked on much. Character customization are basically exceptions to the core rules, so you need the core rules to make exceptions from. The plan is to design the first 3 levels of a class once the core rules are locked in, to get a feel for character progression. Matt and James have talked about how to onboard fresh TTRPG players into the game. They've been toying with the idea of a beginner's adventure where each combat or encounter introduces a new mechanic. During the first combat, you might only have access to the basic attack. Then you unlock the signature attack for the next combat. Then triggered attack for the combat after that. That way, fresh players aren't overwhelmed by the amount of character options on their character sheet. Meanwhile, fresh directors can be eased into the role of running the game. The beginner's adventure can introduce monsters in a similar manner, and other rules in small surmountable portions. Initially, there was a mantra, heroes don't have zeros, meaning that heroes don't have any characteristics that are 0. The thought has been that an average human will have all zeros, but as they tweak the power levels of first level characters, they've experimented with heroes having negative initial characteristic scores. James have been scaling down the power of actions 2 for a while, but he's been doing it in small decrements to prevent overcorrecting. The pregens used for testing have been too powerful and are being debuffed in small steps. There have been some deep talks about the characteristics in general. Matt and James have had meetings on whether they want to keep the 6 characteristic scores as they currently are. It sounds like they've become more comfortable with making their own game on their own terms, and are less concerned about not moving too far away from D20 systems. While it was never a goal to be similar to D20 systems, most players will likely come from D&D, the D20 system. Being too different might throw people off, but I think players in general are more open to something different than initially expected. And the comments about the game outside of the community have focused on how this is a different game from D&D, further preparing players for something new. Skills have previously granted a +1 to ability checks, but have now been changed to a boon, e.g. a 1d4. James also mentioned that they're considering a progression system for skills, where you get better bonuses for a skill the more proficient you are in it. Victory benefits are also being tweaked. So far, they've been available to heroes used in testing, but it looks like those benefits will only be available after heroes have gained a few levels. This also plays into not overwhelming players with too much at first level. James also mentioned that different encounters may grant different amount of victories, depending on how difficult it is. Also, it's not combat and negotiations exclusively that grant victories. We may see other stuff grant victories too. There have been expressed some worries about health and how it scales, specifically that monsters and heroes end up being bullet sponges, where it takes forever to beat them. James said that heroes might start with a thick layer of health, but it won't grow much when leveling up. While a hero starts off with 30 health, for example, a level might only increase health by 5. James also mentioned that they might rename health to stamina. The number of recoveries is being lowered. Playtests have shown that heroes have too many and are able to go on for too long between rests. Negotiation have been pretty well received in the Patreon playtest, but it's become clear people need a better onboarding to the system. Players are unfamiliar with these kinds of systems and will need extra guidelines on how to use them. People seem to respond well to interest and patience, but have struggled with motivations and pitfalls. Matt mentioned a new setup where motivations and pitfalls are categories instead of specific events or subjects. Instead of a character having a motivation that states they want to be remembered after they die, they'll have a bullet point indicating they're motivated by glory, for example. Glory will be listed in the rules as one category of motivation, with an explanation of what that means in general terms. Part of this change is also motivated to make the system feel less rigid and more open for roleplay and improvisation. I mentioned in last month's episode that crafting and research was being worked on soon, but it's been moved to the next 6-week work schedule. That means it won't be worked on for a few weeks still. James has mentioned multiple times over the past month that the game assumes you're going to play on a grid. If you need to translate grid units to meters, the recommendation is to use 2 meters for squares, mostly because of scale considerations. The squares are in reality cubes, which makes creatures that are 1 square very squat if cubes are only a meter on each side. We've also had some information on classes. At the moment, all classes have 1 triggered action. The plan is that each class have a different effect. Some avoid damage, while others might buff allies, for example. Higher level heroes will likely have multiple triggered actions, with a possible maximum of 3 at level 10. Having more than 3 triggered actions is too much to keep track of in combat. Matt mentioned that the Elementalist's signature abilities either target 1 creature and do more damage, or multiple creatures and does less damage. It sounds like this is a design that's going to show up in more classes. Regarding specific classes, there have been a successful internal test of a prototype of the sensor. The concept for the class is that they place seals or interdictions on monsters. The sensor then uses those interdictions to power abilities. The more interdictions placed, the bigger the ability they can use. The sensor and the conduit have some parallels to the cleric and the paladin in D&D, but will feel more different from each other than the D&D classes. Matt has been working on the Elementalist. The Elementalist will wield different elements, but they're not limited to the classical Greek elements of earth, air, fire, and water. In addition, there's also green, rot, and void. Each element represents a concept which they manipulate. Earth represents persistence and strength. Air represents speed and reaction. Fire represents destruction. Water represents change. Green represents life and energy. Rot represents death and decay. And void represents knowledge and emptiness. Matt almost started to work on all 7 subclasses of the Elementalist, but James reined him in and made him focus on 1. While working on the Fire Mage, Matt realized that he or anyone could make a generic Firecaster. Matt wanted the Fire Mage to be more than that, which is where the each element represents something idea came from. Specializing in a single element is likely not done at first level, but comes later. That also means that at first level, elementalists will probably be able to mix and match spells from different elements. The elementalist's current heroic resource is Essence, which is spent to keep spells going. As a free action on their turn, elementalists can spend 1 essence to maintain spells. They can then use signature attacks to gain more essence. Maintained spells can be wards they put on themselves or others, or ongoing effects on enemies. There will probably need to be a limit on how many spells the elementalist can maintain, but how that limit is calculated is not yet determined. Matt has a prototype of a Fire Mage. It's going through internal testing, and the current concept for the Fire Mage is that they not only do damage, but also knock people around, both with their own abilities, but also by assisting others. The Fire Mage's triggered action is currently extending another hero's knockback effect. All of the Fire Mage's spells have higher knockback than any other abilities. The Fire Mage is defined by their high knockback. As part of the work on the Fire Mage, Matt also has come up with the idea of different kinds of fire that behave differently. Psionic or mental fire gives you banes. Elemental fire translates to knockback, while Hellfire, not used by any class yet, might be sticky and gives a lot of permanent effects. While there hasn't been done any proper work on the Water Mage, Matt imagines that they could augment others. One idea is that the Water Mage could use Essence to give other heroes heroic resources. Matt introduced the idea of a generic heroic resource named Clarity. Clarity will have an exchange rate to each of the heroic resources, since 1 focus for the tactician is not equal to 1 rage for the fury. The Water Mage could then grant another hero Clarity, which they exchange for some of their heroic resource. With this work on the Elementalist, it looks like there's not going to be a generalist mage or wizard. Matt said that the role is already held by the talent. There might not be need for a generalist spellcaster. It sounds like they've decided on a name for the RPG, but will not reveal it until they have a license ready for the game. Along with the license, they will also release a dev kit to aid others in creating stuff for the RPG. Matt mentioned that there will be a setting guide for Orden for use by contractors. To be able to create stuff for Orden, contractors will need somewhere to look up specifics about the setting. This setting guide might also be shared with patrons, but this is still uncertain. It's been confirmed that the partner for the VTT is DM Hub. DM Hub currently has a working VTT with in-depth support for D&D 5e. According to the announcement from DM Hub, the collaboration with MCDM is on a separate VTT product that leverages the core of their existing VTT. Matt says there is some work to be done with UI and UX to make the VTT better at explaining itself to new users, and he wants a parser that can parse stat blocks so that it's possible to use the VTT for testing. Last month's episode mentioned that Trenchworks was selling MCDM minis. They now have all minis listed, including the ones previously available in the MCDM shop. All existing stock of minis has been transferred to Trenchworks. The community has been hard at work, and here is some of what they've created. First off, we've got a sister podcast, the Dice Society. They'll also be covering information about the RPG and MCDM news. They have 2 episodes out now. Link can be found in the link section. Erotic Toaster has created a sheet for retainers. It's a Google Sheets document for easy reference and overview. Colonel 17 never fails to deliver. Another set of retainers from different parts of the timescape. This time, Abyssal Wasteland, Quintessence, Equinox, and Astral Sea. They've also put all the retainers in a single resource where you can get them all. Damien V has reimagined kits from the MCDM RPG in Dungeons & Dragons 5e with guidelines on how to implement the concept in your D&D game. Uncle Fudge has created a list of action-oriented abilities from Flea Mortals. The list only contains a short description of what each ability is, without details and numbers. The goal is to aid you in homebrewing monsters. Ryu Owo has put together a more interesting human race for D&D 5e, inspired by the humans in the MCDM RPG. Kruyi has put together 7 talent-specific retainers based on the different subclasses of the talent. Swim Avidly has put together an optimized build guide for a telekinetic talent. It includes tips on how to build your character at first level and what options to pick when leveling up. Links to everything can be found in the links section in the episode description. As I mentioned earlier, December was a month with tons of details about the RPG, while January has been a month of people playing and talking about the RPG. The Around the Web section of the links section is brimming with people talking about the RPG. And that's all I have for January of 2024. If you know of anything that should be included next time, send me an email to tips@goblinpoints.com. Until next time, Sanakis.